Hi, this is Trevor Conquergood. Welcome to this week's RNK Software Club's video of the week. And this week we're going to learn how to create a freestanding lace embroidery design from a JPG image. And so what I'm going to do is actually go into our library of free monthly designs and browse through to the month of March and click on March 2021, and in there you will find this lace trichera knot, and this is the JPG, and that's the actual design. And let's just go ahead and bring those onto our screen. There's the photograph. You can see what the design is. It's satin stitch columns that create kind of a intertwined little Celtic knot, and I've included a mesh fill background, and that makes it suitable for being like sewn on wet and gone freestanding lace. And to make it extra pretty, I used a sheet of mylar, which is a special kind of topper, which got captured kind of inside of the mesh fill, and it makes those, I guess this could be either a set of earrings or a little pendant. One way or another, it's a freestanding embroidery design. And so when you want to create something like this, you're obviously going to look for a piece of artwork. I don't know about you, but I don't really draw things myself from my memory, and so I need an image. Let's see, I'm going to bring the finished embroidery design also onto my screen. You can see the image is much larger than the design, but we'll just kind of put them side by side like this. So this is our inspiration. This is what we're, I guess, planning to make today, is a little freestanding lace trichera knot. And so you go looking for artwork, and I found a JPG of this knot, and I also created as an SVG just so that you could see what the difference is. Now, if you can find an SVG artwork for your design that you want to make, that's great news, because and so I'm going to open up the SVG image of this knot, and what you'll notice right away is that my artwork is made up of shapes. You can see them in the sequence view, right? There are shapes here, and you can easily select these shapes and come down here and assign, the styles of stitching to it. And so this is an SVG that is not only made up of shapes, but is an SVG that's made up of the exact shapes that we just happen to need to make this embroidery design. Sometimes you get an SVG, but these shapes aren't kind of exactly what you want. Imagine that what you had was like one shape was the outline of the knot, and then the other shapes were like the inside shapes. In that case, creating the embroidery, takes I guess really what you have for artwork really kind of helps shape the steps you're going to take to create your embroidery. Let's assume that you didn't find an SVG artwork, and what you ended up with is what we most often do, is some kind of a pixelated backdrop like a JPG or a bitmap or this kind of thing. So this is very typical of something you might find on the internet. Looks good on the internet, but when you zoom in on it, you realize, it's not really very good artwork. Actually, it's quite low resolution. And because the artwork is kind of low resolution, it does mean that the automatic tools are really going to struggle a little bit. I mean, you could use, for example, take the magic wand tool, click on this shape, and it will automatically trace it for us. And it does a pretty good job of tracing it. But that said, because the lines are so sort of wiggly, therefore it doesn't give really perfectly smooth lines. And I know you could go in and smooth those lines out and fix them up, but this is kind of the other challenge for it, is that now the artwork is really quite complex, and it's not going to be easy for the software to convert it into embroidery. I mean, if you just want it to be all one kind of a flat fill like this, it's not too bad, but that's nowhere near the nice dimensional kind of Celtic design that I created. Now, you could take the same artwork and try and use the auto satin tool, but what happens is the software does its best, but it gets confused. Maybe there's some spots that seem to be left out. Maybe there's some, you don't like the way it did the over and the under. It doesn't seem to be completely natural. And I know that you can fix that. you can go in and use your shape tool, and now you're looking at all of the stitch inclination lines and all of the divide lines. And so you can say, well, why would the software put the divide line there? Wouldn't it have made more sense to have put it like there or something like that? And then if that's the case, then I won't make these stitch angles kind of seesaw back and forth. And so you can see how you are really in control. But what process will you take to get there? So if you like automatically digitizing, you may spend more of your time fixing it. So what I'm going to show you is a process that's kind of tested and true for a professional digitizer. It doesn't really put the emphasis on the artwork. In other words, even a poor quality kind of JPEG like this will work. If I bring in the kind of finished design as my muse so that you can see kind of what I'm trying to create, the first thing I did when I went from this JPEG image to this embroidery design is I printed it off on a piece of paper. And that allowed me to draw on it. And what I did was I worked out what was going to be over and what was going to be under, because the JPEG image has flattened that out, and we don't know whether the circle is going on top or whether this loop is going on top. And so I don't know that there's a correct way, but another thing you could do is look for some Celtic jewelry for some inspiration on where would it go over and where would it go under. So what I'm saying is I worked this out on a piece of paper, drawing little lines on top until I had it figured out. Now, when I go to digitize it, I know what I'm doing. Oh, okay. The first piece, in fact, if we just watch how the original design sewed out, it starts out with a piece of mesh. Now that might sew first, but I actually digitized it last, and I'll explain that later. But then I do some run stitch and then the little loop, and then you can see I do that first little kind of like piece of those knots, and then it goes and does the next piece of the knots. And so they're kind of broken into little segments. Now, I did that to try and avoid having too much extra stitches in the unders where the columns kind of go under each other. But that said, I'm really only saving a few stitches, and it wouldn't have been wrong if somebody was to have just kind of kept going and allowed the columns to go over and under each other. So let me show you how I do it. So first of all, we're going to have to create our own shapes, and so we're going to be digitizing them. And probably the easiest way to do that is just to click on the artwork tool. There are different modes of drawing, but probably the simplest one is the line mode. And when you use line mode, you click, click, click to draw your line. And if you hold down your control key, it will curve your lines. And if you stop holding down control, it will leave them like sharp corners. And if you right click, you stop drawing the line. And there, I drew a piece of artwork. That is a sort of vector shape, if you will. I'll select it and delete it because we didn't really want it. So what I really want to do is draw a piece that, if you look over here, it starts sewing here and kind of finishes down there, right? So basically, take your artwork tool, zoom in a little bit more closely and say, okay, it starts sewing there. And it kind of goes, so now what I have to do is draw the outline of the shape. And even though those pixels are all kind of pixelated, I can just kind of like smooth them out. I'll just decide where's the edge of the shape myself. And basically, I hold down my control key along this edge to keep it curved all the way to the tip. Now, it's the first point after the tip that I don't hold down control, because if I did, it would curve from this point through the second point to the third point. It goes backwards for 2 points. And so we want that sharp. So we don't hold control down for this click. However, for the next click, we do hold down control. That will smooth that line out. And so I continue kind of going along, drawing this shape. And what I'm drawing is the outline of the shape. So there's where it kind of actually, no, it keeps going across. I'm just remembering now, it goes across the divide like this and down to here. That's where I had it stopping. And then I don't hold down control, draw the next piece across, and now coming back, kind of around the other side, if you will, holding control up to the corner. Now I don't hold it. Now I hold it again. And now I've kind of gotten to that point where I can taper it off maybe like that and right click. So we drew a piece of artwork. You know, it's there. If I hide the image, you'll see nice and clean, smooth lines. Now we have to assign the stitching to it, right? And I know you can click on Auto Satin, which would allow the software to decide where the stitch angles goes. Or you could click on the Satin tool and tell it yourself, you know, how to do them. So let's try that for the next time. That was auto. So basically now the stitching is sitting right here. And I want to do my next piece down here. And so I guess what I'm going to have to do is select that piece and just go into shape mode and move the red point down to here. Now that's something that we'll get a little bit more control over in the next piece, because we won't use auto satin, we'll use the regular satin. So I'm going to go ahead and click to draw it. So just click on your pencil, click there. Hold down control, and then so this piece goes to here. And once again, sort of not holding down control for corner points and holding down control for smoothie points. Right click to stop drawing, select that shape. Now this time I'm going to click, instead of on auto satin, I'll click on the satin tool. And what happens is it waits for me to draw the inclinations. And so I'll say, well, let's put one inclination that matches that side and one inclination that matches that side, and then right click. And now it allows me to adjust the green entry and the red exit points to wherever I want them to be. And then I right click and it makes the stitches. So I got a little bit more control over that versus using the auto. So now my needle is sitting here, and we're going to do the next column. And so if you're not sure, you look to your notes to see how it went. And so I've done this piece and this piece. Now we need to do this piece. It kind of starts here and goes until there. And so I'll zoom in. By the way, you might wonder how it is that I zoom in and out like this when I don't seem to be grabbing any tools to do it. And that is because I know that my mouse has a little wheel on it, and I can scroll the wheel towards me to get further away. I can scroll the wheel away from me to get closer to my design, and it goes right to wherever I put my mouse. So if I want to see, you know, that area right there, I put my mouse over it, and then I scroll with my wheel, and I can get closer and further away. So I want to get closer here, so I put my mouse there and scroll in. Now I'm nice and close and ready to digitize, and so I click on the artwork tool again, and I click on to start the artwork, and I draw around the shape. And so basically this is kind of how it goes. You draw all of your artwork, and then you assign your stitches. And so it's a more manual process, I realize, than, let's say, the automatic digitizing. However, it's a little bit more methodical, because this will sew exactly as you create it. Whatever you create first will sew first. Whatever you create second will sew second. They'll give the stitches that you choose. They will be kind of the style of embroidery that you sign. So right click, that's the fine. See how the entry and the exit, like that's where it finished. That's where it's going to start. And we don't need to have a run stitch in between here, because those 2 points are so close together that there's no need to have like any extra segment in between. Now, I don't know why the exit point would be there. I'd rather it be kind of like here at the end, leading, you know, into the next segment. So right click to make those stitches. So anyway, I'm making the shapes as I go, one at a time, and I've been using a process that's like draw the artwork and then assign the stitching. But you can take it a step further and use the digitizing tools. So artwork makes artwork, and then you use the tools at the bottom to assign the stitches. But digitizing tools, it's like you draw the artwork and it assigns the stitches all at the same time. And so you have options: manual, run stitch, satin stitch, classic satin stitch, steel stitch, complex fill stitch, and applique. And so if I choose, for example, satin stitch, and then I click to start drawing, and just like before, I go and I draw the outline of the piece that I want to make. And so I think it went to here, and then it stopped. And so I'm just kind of carefully doing that. Like I said earlier, hold down control when you need a curvy point, and don't hold control down if it's going to be a straight point. Now, because I've used the digitizing tool, when I right click from drawing, it's already waiting for me to tell it the stitch directions. And I can put in as many different stitch directions as I want to. Now, when I right click, it gives me the green point and allows me to click where it should be. So I'll click the closest point to the previous exit. And then I get to assign the red point. And so I'll choose there. So that's a little bit different because we did the whole step all at one time. Let's do it again. So again, we're going to do the point right here. I'm just going to simply start to draw my shape. And I believe we got into our first over. So now I'm drawing a shape that actually goes over top of this one. And so I'll draw my kind of stitches right up to it, like perpendicular to the edge of the shape like that. And then I'll come back around the outside, sort of like before, right? Draw the perimeter or the outside of your shape. And that's where it is the last point. Now I right click. Now you assign those stitch inclinations again. And I'm going to put an inclination that runs this to be sort of like perpendicular to the column that it's going to go over. Right click. Now, where should it start sewing? Well, closest, across from here. Basically there would be fine. Exit point, right, let's say right there. So now my needle is sitting right here. And so this is the point before. If I start my next one right here, the thread will jump directly across the shape and hide in it. If I start my next shape over here, that thread will jump across the shape but not hide in it because it's going across the stitch directions. So the point is, we'll want to make sure to put our green point for our next shape right here. And you can keep drawing your shapes. It's the same kind of process over and over again. You draw kind of each piece as you need. Oops. Now, I held down the control key when I didn't want to. Can you see that? It made my point kind of curvy. And so I'm going to hit my backspace key. While I'm drawing, I can undraw. So I just backspace. Now, remember, don't hold down control, Trevor. Don't hold down control. Now you can hold down control and it will curve out this line. But so I thought I would show you that. If you're digitizing and you make a point you don't like, you can kind of like go backwards with the backspace tool and just get rid of a few points that you made and make them over again. So now I've drawn all the way around the shape. I right click. I'm going to give it a stitch direction right here. And I think I'll give it another stitch direction right about like that. And then right click. So again, the entry point needs to be here so that it can hide across that kind of gap there. And then the exit point can be right there. So that's what we call an over. The unders, I actually left a gap in the thread so you can see that where we've gone under, I've made a little bit of a space, but when we go over, I just make sure that the trailing thread doesn't go diagonally across the top, but directly across it. So now we've got just a few more pieces to make and we're getting close to being done. What I'm going to do is draw this piece. Now, when I draw this piece, I'm going to want to set the entry point there. And then the exit point here. Does that make sense? So basically you can start drawing it wherever you want. Doesn't actually matter when you're using this tool where how you draw the shape. Just draw that shape and then assign the type of stitching. I'm left clicking and holding the control key down when I want to make it curvy like that. And just following along my artwork. Now here is where I have to stop. And so I just make my stitching kind of like perpendicular to that line. And then I come back around the horn like this. And I can probably stop right about there. I don't usually close my shapes as much as I'll just bring them close together and then right click to stop drawing because the software doesn't need it to be closed. And what the problem is, if you try and kind of like click the last point right beside the first one, sometimes it makes kind of like a little, warble in your shape and it confuses the stitches. So now remember, it's waiting for me to put the stitch angles in. And so I'm going to put one in that's more like a little bit parallel, like with that, or perpendicular, sorry, to that shape. And one maybe right here. And then same thing down on this side. We'll kind of make it go sort of like flat to the ends like that. Right click. Remember, I'm going to make it start sewing here. And then I'm going to put the exit point over here. So we're almost done, you guys. We just have 2 more pieces to do. Now, here we have to, if we allow it to jump from here to there, it should hide, right? If we allow it to jump from here to there, it is not going to hide. If you're ever concerned, or maybe you needed to start here, or maybe you really wanted it to go directly across and not, kind of cut across a couple stitches, what you can do is you can also use in the digitizing toolbox, the manual tool. And so I could click right on the previous stitch, walk directly across the column with a stitch, and then I can take a step backwards and into that corner. That way I make sure that it doesn't, that thread will always hide like that. Now, so we've been using the method right now where we used the classics, or the satin path tool to digitize it and assign the stitches all at one time. How about we look at the one next to it now? This is called the classic satin tool, and it's very similar in what it makes, but you do it differently. So remember the one before, you draw the outline, right click, and then draw the inclinations, right click, and then set the entry and the exit. That's what we just did. So now we're going to do it differently. With classic satin, we have to enter in sets of points that represent the stitch directions. And so there's my needle sitting there, and if the first stitch direction is meant to be from here to there, I draw it. Point, point. Now I come back to side 1, and then back to side 2 again, and each set of points makes a new stitch direction. And now I'm going to hold the control key down to smooth my lines. And so I'm kind of trying to change the stitch direction from this angle to get it kind of like, so I put in a sort of like a couple of sets of points to deal with my angles. But what I'm doing is every time I put in a set of points, I go to side 1 and then directly across on side 2. And so the software learns the shape and the stitch directions at the same time. And so here we're almost done. I'm going to put down a point there and then my final point right there. And when I right click, we're done. So that tool, it starts sewing where you start, and it finishes sewing where you finish, and it chooses the angles that you chose as you drew it. So again, here's one of those times where I want to go across the road, but I don't really want it to go right to the next point. And so I'll just click in a manual stitch. The manual stitch right here, I'll just go across the shape and then take a step back again. That way I just ensure that that stitch comes across. And so really the last piece of the trick here, not to make, we're just going to do, and again, I'll use that classic satin tool, and I go 1, 2 to create my first stitch direction, back to side 1. And again, I'm just going to go 1, 2 to create a new stitch direction, and 1, 2 to make another stitch direction. And I kind of try to gently turn my stitch directions around the shape until I reach the other side. And I right click. And so different methods of doing this digitizing, but what I really love about it is when I draw the shapes, they tend to sew exactly as I imagine them. And so it's very different than the automatic process where you spend less time creating and more time editing. In this case, you spend a little bit more time kind of on the creation side, but then it sews exactly as you want. Now, all this design is meant to be a lace design, and we haven't really sort of taken care of the lace requirements. And the first thing you'll notice is I put a mesh background behind mine. Plus, I also put a little loop in my design. Where'd the loop come from? There's no loop in that artwork. So basically, you can either draw yourself a little loop, or you can find one in a design you already own. If you look backwards in the free monthly designs from December of 2020 or 2019. In both cases, there is a cool set of little, these are like ornaments that are snowflake ornaments, There's a medium-sized one for your tree and a small one for like earrings or a pendant kind of thing. Of course, when you bring in a design like that, it's going to be all grouped together. And so what you're going to need to do is click on the ungroup tool so that you can click off to deselect everything and then zoom in over the little kind of loop that was in that design and select it. And then maybe we'll just click the copy tool to make a copy of that loop and bring it over, to our design. And then now that we've got what we wanted, we can just get rid of all, we were just simply pinching the loop out of that design there. So we've got it. Now, where do you want to put your loop? You can put it wherever you want. I put mine right at the top, kind of like this. But if you were thinking you wanted your earrings to be a little more asymmetrical, what you could do is you could rotate your loop to be more like on an angle and then anchor it in, kind of like that. Okay, so now we're getting close. We still have a few more things to pay attention to. First of all, when you copy and paste something, it comes to the end of the design. So we currently have a design with the loop sewing after all of these, knot pieces. And that doesn't make much sense, right? You're going to want to select that knot and move it up so that it sews before that stuff. Plus, you're probably going to want to select that knot and combine it with the other color so that it's all one color, right? We don't need a color stop for the loop. And so it'll do the loop and then it'll do the little knots. Now, when I made that loop sew prior to the other pieces, right? But remember when we started this piece, it started over here. So now that I've added this loop and it sews before this piece, what I probably want to do is select that piece, use my shape tool, and move the entry point to match up with that little knot, with that little loop that we've got. So that's called pathing, and it just ensures that there's less sort of jumps and trims in your design. At this point, what we don't have is the mesh background. The original design started out with a piece of mesh, and so the mesh is there for two reasons. First of all, I used it to capture some mylar, and that makes it extra sparkly. Mylar is like a topper that you place on top of your wet and gone, and when you sew on it, it will, kind of like tear away around it, and you're left with a sparkly inside. And so we'll do that. But the other reason why I want to have this mesh fill is even if I didn't use the Mylar, this mesh fill will always ensure that my lace knot stays, in the correct shape when you dissolve it with your water dissolving material. And so we've got our, everything's kind of ready, but what we don't have is that sort of little lace. So to make that, what we'll do is we'll create a shape. So I'm going to click on the artwork tool. And what we want to do is make a shape that's not, each of these little loops anymore. Now we're looking at kind of like the overall kind of outline of it. So here, let's just click here and then, just click around your shape to get not the outline of each piece, but the common outline of all of the pieces. And I'm sort of just instinctually tucking it towards the outside of the green, but not right up to it. I'm leaving a little bit of what you might call an overlap so that, I don't want any of that mesh to poke out and be showing on the outside of the green. And so this is the concept that I'm just drawing a shape that will then convert into a piece of mesh, and it'll be the background for the whole trichera knot. And so I know it's interesting to see somebody create a design kind of from scratch like this. We're not quite done, but we're getting close. Now can you see how I've gotten, back to the beginning of where I started drawing this line? And again, I'm not going to bother to close it. I don't need to. I can just right click because when I select the shape, first of all, if you really wanted it closed, let's make it yellow or something so you can see it. If you really want it closed, you can click on the close shape tool and that will connect, the last point to the first point. But that for that matter, it doesn't matter if it's open. You can still just click on the mesh fill and it'll put down a mesh background in your shape. Now, when the mesh background first comes in, it just does one layer of mesh, which is great for capturing some mylar. But if you want to do freestanding embroidery, you really need to do a 2-layer one that has like 2 layers that interlock with each other. And so to do that, what I do is I look to my properties box. And here in the properties box, the little 3 dots, that will enable you to choose the pattern of your mesh fill. And so there's all kinds of, different patterns. And so if you select one of the ones that has 2 layers that are interlocking, it's more suitable for doing a freestanding embroidery design. So now you can see, obviously, the sewing sequence is wrong because we drew the mesh in last, so therefore it's the last thing that sews, when really it needs to be the first thing that sews, right? So we would need to move that design up, to be so before the screen mesh or borders. So we're almost done now, you guys. The only thing that we really haven't considered is the stitch properties. Now, the mesh fill, you could maybe decide to have more or less of it. So the density, if I wanted to have a tighter mesh, I bring my number from 4 down to 3 or 2. It's going to make more mesh. Same thing if you want less mesh, change your densities. But probably more importantly for a design like this, for freestanding lace, it's all of these green satin paths that we made in the beginning. Those satin paths, if you look at them, they're going to need some additional underlay. And right now they just have their default, which when you create a shape, if you look at it, its default underlay, that's the underlay tab right there, is parallel. And what I would probably say for freestanding lace is I might add a contour. So notice when I add the contour, it adds an additional underlay that kind of outlines the shape. And that's not wrong. Essentially underlay are a very important part of a freestanding design to keeping it kind of connected together. And so I would probably select all the satin paths. Watch how I can use the all segments tool and tell it just satin paths, and how it brings out all the satin paths, and I can just get all those green satin paths. Now, this is going to be a mixture of both of them because I ended up, remember we have the finished design and the partially through made design. If I want, I can just click and drag a box, and that will select just the green satin paths from that half of the design. Anyhow, one way or another, what you want to do is go in and give them a contour and parallel underlay, but not necessarily a zigzag. Now, I didn't get them all. So what did I do wrong? Maybe what I'll do just to make this easy is I'm just going to snip this other one out for a minute. We'll just use the cut tool. I can always paste it back in later. And that way I don't have I only have the design that we're working on, and I can select all those satin paths like this and just come to the underlay tab and make sure that I have both contour and parallel and click apply. And it's not wrong to even go contour instead of parallel. You could go to zigzag, and so watch when I add zigzag, it just does more of it. So, that's not wrong. When you're doing a freestanding embroidery design, you want to have kind of quite a bit of that underlying stitches. Probably one more thing that I'll say in terms of the object preferences is anytime I've got a column like that that's got quite a bit of underlay underneath it, I usually go to the push and pull tab and maybe assign a little bit of extra pull compensation. So I'll try like 0.2 of a millimeter on both sides. So it's kind of like saying, it adds 0.4 of a millimeter, almost half a millimeter wider. So did you see that? I'll just hit undo and then redo. It just fattens it up a little bit, just gives it a little, That way you ensure that it covers all of those underlay stitches and none of them end up poking out. So that's it, you guys. We made a freestanding lace design from a JPG image, and we talked about all the different kind of mythology and thought process that goes into it. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's class or today's video. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.